Hi again then guys, and welcome to another specific car review from Forza 7, and of course this is once again a DLC vehicle from a couple of packs back now, and this is one which, I won't lie, I was disappointed with when I first saw it, but not because I dislike the car or anything in particular about it. It was more so that I disliked that they made this choice, and of course many of you who have been around on the channel for some time will probably know immediately why I was disappointed with this car, because of course it's so tantalisingly close to having one of my favourite Grand Prix cars ever, one of my favourite race cars ever, featured in the game, and actually featured in Forza or Gran Turismo for the first time. Gran Turismo has referenced the car, but never featured it, but they've come close with the Chaparral 2J, and that is of course the fan car, the Brabham BT45 B. As I said, one of my favourite Formula cars, one of my favourite Grand Prix cars in general, and an incredibly capable car. It's got one of the most flawless records of any race car. One race, one win, 100% victory ratio, and had it been allowed to race more, it would have probably done really well again, since it won that first race by over 30 seconds with Lauda at the wheel. This one though is not that car, and that's why I was disappointed, because it's so close to that vehicle, but still not quite. This is of course the BT45 B, also obviously a Brabham, similar looking car, but it doesn't have the huge fans sticking out the back end, and the car itself doesn't look quite as beefy as the 46B does, mainly due to the aero changes. But what does this one offer? Because of course with the fan car you could view it as kind of a gimmick, which it sort of is, but it's a very effective one, whereas with this car it's a much more traditional Grand Prix car. It's what you'd expect from, say, a 70s Formula machine. So with that in mind, and without the advantage of a fan, what does it still bring to the table? Is it good against the other classic Formula cars, the classic Grand Prix cars, or in a similar way to some of them, is it kind of more of a collector's piece? Well, to some degree I would say it has some use, but at the same time it definitely falls more on the side of being historically relevant rather than relevant for racing now. Now, that's not to say that you can't use it to win races, of course, but the inherent problem that occurs with Grand Prix especially, but kind of in other forms of racing as well, I mean, it does apply to all racing, but it's not as obvious with others as it is with Grand Prix, because the sport advances so rapidly, especially from decade to decade, and to some degree from year to year as well, but you notice it a lot more with decades. The cars get so much quicker and so much more capable as you pass from 70s to 80s to 90s to 2000s, that the inherent problem that brings up is that if you have an older Formula machine, it's way too good to go up against older ones, like from the 50s for instance, obviously, but it's also no way near fast enough to take on, say, 80s or 90s machines, in most cases at least. And that's again kind of the reason why I wanted them to add the fan car, because given that it was 30 seconds quicker in its day in 1978, it could well have actually taken on Formula cars from the 80s as well, and maybe even some from the 90s. Not necessarily from the 2000s or the 2010s, but definitely from the 80s and probably from the 90s, because it was that much more advanced. Now, this one doesn't have that advantage, and because it doesn't, you know what you're going to get. It's lightweight at 585 kilos, it's not as powerful as you might expect. It's got exactly 500 horsepower, which sounds pretty low for a Formula car or for a Grand Prix car, and the torque is extremely low, 239 pound-feet, which is kind of like in the territory of something like a VTEC Honda. So, not too surprisingly, it's not exactly got a ton of grunt. But at the same time, because it has such a small amount of weight to shift, it's not slow, that's for sure. Now, the horsepower per tonne is still over 850, because even though the power isn't huge, the weight is so low. It makes something like a Lotus or a KTM Crossbow look heavy in comparison. Now, as far as pricing, of course you don't have to buy it, because it's a DLC car, thankfully. If you were going to though, it's actually not badly priced. It's 495,000 credits, which, for a vintage Grand Prix car, or a classic one really, that's quite good, that's quite affordable. It's a great collector's piece. And I would say that my favourite things about the car are the cockpit view, which is fantastic, and that's actually one thing that I prefer about some classic Grand Prix cars, especially from the 70s, compared to today, because with today's cockpits it's very technical. You can see wings all around you, you've got all the technical stuff on the steering wheel, all the buttons, etc, etc, which of course is what it's all about now, whereas back then it's much more raw, it's much more simple. You've just got this little 3-spoke rubber rimmed steering wheel, nothing around you except for a couple of wing mirrors, you can barely see the front wing, and it's pretty much just you and the road. I really like that. That's one of the reasons why I kind of prefer driving some of these older Formula cars from the 60s and especially the 70s. Actually, the 70s is possibly my favourite era of Grand Prix, even though I'm not a huge Grand Prix fan in general. So this one really suits me in terms of driving style. The handling is really good, the car is super compact. I also love how these older Grand Prix cars had these really fat, sticky rear tyres, but quite small front wheels as well. And I don't just mean the tyres, I mean the rim itself is notably smaller at the front, in a similar way to how in the late 80s Mercedes did a similar thing with the Sauber C9, the Group C car. If you look at the difference in size between the rear wheels and the front, it's quite notable. It's actually got really small wheels on the front, but it won the race. So of course it's not just about the wheels, but it shows the potential that's there. Now, one of the things that I like about driving this one is because it's so simple and so old school and so raw, you really feel like you're doing the work. Whereas with a modern Formula car, even something from say the later 90s, certainly the 2000s and onward, you feel like the car is doing most of it for you. With, of course, aero designs and electronic tech, which is far more advanced than they have ever been with every passing year, with regen and all that kind of stuff, active aero. But the purity of these older ones, to me, has the kind of advantage that I want from a car like this, because as I said earlier, the problem inherently with having an older Grand Prix car is that it's very, very pigeonholed into just going up against its primary rivals from the time, because unless it was outstandingly good from its year or from its decade, you're probably not going to be able to race it against much newer stuff, and that definitely applies here. But if you're looking purely for the enjoyment of driving an old Grand Prix car, I would say this one is actually one of the best in the game. It's definitely one of my favourites, because although it's not the fastest thing around, far from it as far as the Grand Prix cars go, in a similar way to say the 1930s Grand Prix machines, or even some earlier ones like the Silver Arrows, for instance, from Germany, the Auto Unions, that kind of stuff, you just feel so connected to the road. It's almost like driving a really overboard go-kart. Something that's got way more power than a go-kart would have, but has that same kind of vibe. It's raw, it's simple, and it appeals to the side of my personality that I've always had as a mechanic in real life, and that is that I have a mechanically geared brain, in effect, rather than an electronic one. I don't particularly enjoy doing electronic work, whereas mechanical stuff, gears, cogs, that sort of thing, that appeals to me much more. So cars like this really do it for me in terms of driver enjoyment. You can feel that you're the one in control, even though of course you have stuff like advanced tyre compounds, the downforce from the wings. It's still a very advanced car, for its time especially of course, but if you're going to buy one now, or if you're going to pick it up in the game, it's not the kind of vehicle that I'd recommend getting if you expect to win everything. It's just not that kind of car anymore. If you're in a room where you're racing vintage Grand Prix cars, which chances are you probably will be, then you'll have a pretty good chance, because it's a very, very good all-rounder. The top speed's good for the power, the acceleration is good, the handling's definitely good. So if you do get the chance to pick it up, if you've got the DLC pack, then of course you can, then I think you'll enjoy driving it. You just might not necessarily get as much racing use out of it as some of the other race cars that we have in the game. But that's it for this pick overall. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.